we underestimate the extent because we're modern people and we think ancient people were kind of dumb. That's what we do. I don't, but, we underestimate, generally speaking, the expertise, the mechanical capabilities, and the cultural interest that people would have in making a all-in-one device that incorporates, movements and other things into that device that you can adjust given where you are, time of the year, and so on. Yeah. Yeah. So, ancient computer, I don't know, drop some acid. Maybe it's an ancient computer. I didn't see a computer chip in there, right?
Yeah, I mean,
You know what, Alex? I wasn't taking opium at the time either. I might have been able to see that had I had a good dose of an opium pipe. I don't know.
If you're sick or sad, the next song is to make you feel so glad. Now here comes your musical remedy. Wow! It is. And this is your musical remedy, Right. Watch out.
Con este remedio sé que nos vamos a sentir muy bien. Lo sienten en Oaxaca, lo sienten en Brasil.
So I'm Alex Distefano. Welcome back, everyone. This is our 4th episode of the tapes at Blue Beach Studios. We're in Redondo Beach. Please check us out on YouTube. Subscribe to our Patreon. You're watching bluebeach.tv. Today, I'm honored to have a special guest, Dr. David Cheetham, your archaeology professor and expert in Mesoamerican civilizations, like the Olmecs, the Mayans. We'll get into it, the Aztecs. You've also appeared on the History Channel show Ancient Aliens and others as an expert. So, there's a lot I want to talk to you about. We talked a little bit previously, but I just first wanted to start with how did you get into archaeology? Like, what sparked your interest in that? Like, how did you decide that was something you want to do as a career?
I come from a place in Canada where it was kind of small town, and there were a lot of abandoned houses and other things like that. I don't know. I just was always fascinated with history and old history. My family lived in this and still lives in the same village since the late 1700s. Not on my mother's side. So it's I've always been interested in history. So I just took it further.
Okay, and in Canada, what part of Canada was it? Was there, like, aside from the like abandoned houses, was there any kind of other ancient things around there? Any kind of things you were getting into besides that, or what?
No, I wasn't doing it, but of course there's prehistory and history through it all of Canada, and even the Arctic has Inuit people and so on. So yeah, there's everything from Huron and Algonquin and you name it. Lots of tribal and hunting gathering groups in Canada.
Right. So
You're one hunting and gathering.
Right. So it sounds like you were kind of into this topic in history and archaeology from like a younger age. Is that right?
Oh yeah.
And
yeah.
And you read a lot of books. Who were some of like the early books or like early authors or books you read about archaeology and like history?
Nothing. You know what? That's a great question. I've never been asked that. I remember reading a couple of books on Egyptian stuff, and they were talking about mummies. I was probably 6 or something.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And I thought, that would be really interesting. One was called Tombs, Treasure, and something else. I can't remember right now. My dad had it. My dad had a little, library and so on. And so I really don't know. I just read a lot.
Right.
And reading stuff when I was little.
Okay. And then so, it sounds like you're really into it, and like history connects with archaeology. But I mean, what was there like a point where you decided you want to focus on Mesoamerica, and like why did you want to, when and why did you kind of like decide that was the area you wanted to focus in on?
Well, I think that's a bit like horseshoes or something here, because I was originally going to go to South America, and I had opportunities to do that, and they weren't finalized or anything. And then something else came along, and I just sort of roll with it. And I ended up working down in the country of Belize initially, and this is back in 1987 or so. Yeah, a while back, and it just kind of snowballed. It's a bit like you find yourself doing something, and then you've got a little bit of responsibility. And next thing you know, a few months have gone by, and you're kind of more involved. And we've all had these jobs where you sort of merge into it, and you never really think about it. That's kind of what it went like with me.
Okay, and then so Bolivia. I mean, obviously you're able to.
No, Belize.
Oh,
Belize.
Belize.
Yeah, Central America. Yeah.
Okay, and then so did you kind of immediately start doing like the field work, or was it more like into like just this research part? Like, because I remember you.
Oh no, I was thrown right into the fire.
Okay.
Yeah, I was still an undergrad at university, and I was probably 20 or 21, and I was excavating pyramids in the jungle in Central America. So I went from a classroom. We've all been in them, and in the space of a few months, I was doing this. And then, like I said, once you start doing this, you've got responsibilities, and you got to write things and so on. And it just sort of snowballed from there. You know what, Alex? I've been doing this so long right now. I long to do something else, to be honest. It's been like, I guess, it's been 4 decades, man. I've been doing.
Well, like I said,
crazy.
I was about approximately 20 years ago. I was in your class. So it is amazing. Yeah, time flies. I remember you talked a lot about how a lot of your work was, in the identification and like classification of like just pottery, and kind of you're an expert in that, and kind of how you were it was working in like identifying certain cultures and different things based on pottery and stuff. But then also I remember you were talking about the discovery you made. I guess there was a discovery you made, maybe it was a while ago, but you discovered like the first use, or one of the earliest uses of cacao beans in the Olmec rituals. Is that?
Well, I didn't personally. Yeah, I didn't do it personally, but I was part of a group of people that published some things. There was a guy called Terry Powis, who I worked with years ago in Belize, but later doing other things in Chiapas and so on. And he sort of got interested in the origins of chocolate, which are somewhere in Mesoamerica, and he got this great idea where he'd scrape some of the inner side of the pots up near the neck of the pot. Because if you're boiling chocolate like potatoes, it kind of leaves this sort of starchy stuff there at the top of the pot, and it impregnates the ceramic. So he was scraping it off and sending it off to the people at Hershey's. And lo and behold, we were able to identify this this was old too. This was like maybe 1,500 years BC. This wasn't even Maya. This was in Chiapas. But to answer your question, I've looked at pottery and other things, but it's a bit like if you watch a show on archaeology, or say, I don't know, whatever, Indiana Jones or something, I don't know, and you see like these old farts, and they're playing with pottery, and they're doing this and that with the pottery. You think, wow, that's pretty boring, broken pot. But it's never about the pottery, right? So I guess I am an expert on pottery that's from certain parts and times in Mesoamerica, but the pottery is always used to address other issues. Like the research question may have to do with, say, economy, where people are moving stuff. And so we'll look at the pots and see which ones are traded and so on, and use that as I guess you could call it a proxy, or a whipping boy, or a middleman, or something, to get at bigger issues, to reconstruct essentially like facets of ancient culture, economy and religion, and whatever. So there's a lot of sort of basic things like pottery that become sort of vehicles through which we can ask, much more complicated questions than, hey, they used pottery, right?
Right. Yeah, I kind of remember some of the lecture kind of things you were kind of saying was that comparing it to it's more than just a pottery, but you can kind of have other scientists do like chemical tests like you're talking about, and they can discover more about the diet, or like what they used, or different, it was how they cooked and just stuff like that.
Yeah, this is the beauty of the archaeology, Alex. If it's done right, you take those sort of everyday or commonplace things, and then you put them in a framework like you just did, which is called science. You just did it. You're asking questions, so then you can use those things to sort of again, like I said a moment ago, like proxies to get at these other much more interesting questions about people and what they were doing economically or religiously and so on. So that's kind of you sort of hit on the essence of archaeology. I mean, it's the only discipline, I guess you could call it, on the planet Earth that allows us to look at these things before people wrote written records. So right away, it's not Indiana Jones chasing a ball in a cave to steal something. It's the only way we can get at things that we take for granted, like people believe this, or they trade this way, or they live this way. We understand that in our own cultures and even recent ones, but if you go past the written word, this is how we do it. You nailed it, man. Yeah, you know what? You should do my job.
Well, I definitely am curious and I love to learn, but I don't know if have the patience and kind of mind of a scientist. But I definitely appreciate scientists, and that's why I've been really excited to have you on, because it's giving us a perspective of the scientist and like someone who's an expert, not just like you were saying, some of the people on these shows, they are not experts. They don't, they're just reading a script, or they don't really know what they're talking about. They might not believe it, but you're actually out there.
Most of them are not experts. Opinions are a bit like, what,
Yeah.
There's a lot of them around. And it doesn't make them bad people or anything like that. It's just that, I'm not going to ask my gardener to do open heart surgery on me either, right? So, you want the expert when you want to talk about these things. And that said, though, Alex, there's always a group of experts in anything, and they debate this and that with respect to the best scientifically based response to these things, I guess you could say, or answers. But there's no shortage of experts out there.
Well, we'll definitely get into that, because like I said, I just, for me personally, taking your class 20 years ago before, and I was always kind of into those topics, not necessarily believing them, but just always fascinated by those fringe topics. But after taking your class, I believe that like Ancient Aliens was barely even like not a series. It was barely like even a document.
Well, no, it didn't exist.
A few years after. You're right. So seeing you on there kind of was very cool. But I knew already kind of how your perspective. So it kind of was just a very interesting.
And let me just say, Ancient Aliens, that's a recent popularization, on a screen of something that's been around for a long time. And that's pseudoscience. I mean, it goes way, way back in the 60s, Eric von Daniken, and, and on and on. It goes into the way beyond that. And there's always going to be people who want to go from A to Z without, or Z, you call it Z, A to Z without, considering W, forget C.
Yeah.
They've always been around, and there's money to be made off that. A lot of science could be, frankly, a little more jazzy, so the other people wouldn't steal the interpretive spotlight. But
Right.
Here's what it is.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I want to like go back and forth between kind of like what you're an expert in the actual science and like about these civilizations, because I'm fascinated by them. Given that my mom and dad are both born in Mexico, and they've been to the pyramids, and I would like to go one day. So I'm definitely interested in the history and the archaeology, but at the same time, I'm also interested in these fringe ideas and fascinating topics. But one of the reasons, and what's cool to have you on, is that for me, I'm not into hostile debates, but I would basically just kind of like to say.
Me neither, Alex. Well, no, I do most of mine on paper.
But I'm a little more nuanced about it. But I would like to kind of just lay out kind of what their ideas are about these fringe topics, and you can kind of give me your scientific view, and like you're kind of doing a little bit, but in a little bit more of the details as we get on, because there's a lot of cool stuff where, like you were saying earlier, there's kind of maybe half truth and a lot of mystery that they kind of just speculate on. And so it's definitely opened my mind a little bit taking your class, because I used to kind of not necessarily believe it all, but kind of consider everything. But a lot of it is kind of silly. But there's definitely a lot of mystery out there, so we can get into a lot of that. Real quick,
go ahead. If you want to describe any of it, I'll listen, and I'll ask you one or two questions, which will destroy what you're saying, but whatever.
Well,
Go
no,
ahead.
definitely. It's good to get someone who's, like I said, actual.
Glad to break your glass house, Alex. No problem.
No, definitely. No, it's a little bit of like that, but it's definitely good to get different perspectives. Definitely, because if you just listen to, certain people and not get other perspectives, it's kind of like you just have to listen to everyone. But it's good to get someone who's actually does it for a living in your.
You know what? What you're doing is actually kind of important because, you discuss something like you're hypothetically saying, I respond to it. Basically, what you're saying there is, the use of logic, science to, I guess, not destroy, unfortunately, but dismantle something that's based on essentially faith and with, I don't know, naivete or whatever. But yeah, I mean, more of this kind of thing would be done. Cheers.
You mentioned something I really was thinking about this whole time, and I kind of want to bring up in terms of the whole ancient alien thing. I view it as making it like a religion because a lot of it is even based on like the Bible and stuff. So I kind of view it as interesting thoughts and theories. I don't think there's any physical proof, but in a way, it's very similar to like a religious thought, right? I mean, it's not something you can really prove with physical evidence, right?
You want to put your quote faith in people coming from another planet, then yeah, I guess it's like a religion. I don't think they profess to spout any kind of belief system over there, except that, that's a really great point you bring up there.
Well,
I've never thought of it in that way. And I don't think that they're trying to do that, but at the same time, the way the show is kind of structured, they are kind of engendering that, a belief.
If I was going to believe something like ancient aliens, someone who was religious telling me that it's nonsense, I wouldn't accept that. But somebody who's an actual expert and scientist telling me it's nonsense, I would accept that because to me, it's very similar to religion. They even use the Bible and biblical stories and like, I think it's very religious in nature.
You're kind of, at the risk of maybe boring some of the people it's be watching. You're kind of answering your own question. And I guess I'm not a counselor or anything like that.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is everything you're saying is encapsulated in the word belief. Because a belief is not about evidence. This is a really, really critical point that I use when I teach religion and culture classes, upper division stuff. And it's like belief systems are valid. They're real, right? Religions are real things. They're valid, but they're based upon belief. Now, if we consider something on the other side that's based upon the accumulation of facts for interpretation, that's an empirical, again, it's a boring word, but I'll use empirical. It's, what is that, 50 syllables? An empirical thing. And empiricism involves facts, data, things you can touch, measure, see, etc. Beliefs, on the other hand, are based on that. They're based on beliefs, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that's what they're based on. Science, that empirical science, is based on things you can see, measure, and whatever else. It's based on observation. So it's a great a point you make, which you didn't intend to make, but I'm making it here, I hope, is that you have two different paradigms to think about the world around you. And if you get into the one that's belief-based, that's people's business. That's cool, but it's not the same. I don't want to sound like I'm putting a cement wall between the two things, but philosophically, logically, it's kind of more like concrete and steel, the wall between the two things.
So in your opinion,
It's made sense to you.
It does. But is there no, in your, viewpoint, or is there no way that those two paradigms could coexist? I mean,
well, they do coexist, and they've always coexisted. There's no such thing as a culture, for example, that doesn't have religion, but yet there's a logical deductive thing going on. Some cultures will look at something that falls on somebody's foot and say, well, there's a reason it fell on Alex's foot and not on David's foot. Why? Because they don't use coincidence and so on. but it's not faith. That's a supernatural thing. So there's always a kind of causation, and causal things are based on stuff you can see, hear, measure, and photograph, whatever it is, right? That's the science end of it. And when you get across the sort of rainbow bridge there into the faith-based or belief system, it's not invalid. Simply, it's different. And this is such an important point, especially in this day and age, right? You know, you have people spouting all kinds of BS about stuff they don't know anything about, and it's based on kind of not even hearsay. It's based on sort of an implicit faith, and it's silly. I don't mean they're stupid, but it's not the thing over here in my other hand that I was talking about a minute ago. Right. It's over here. So, yeah, you know, I don't want to get too philosophical with you, but we could talk about aliens. We could talk about politics. We could talk about religion. We could talk about anything. And it always comes back to these two things. What can we know with certainty versus what do we want to believe we know, which is based on non-empirical things. That's called faith or belief.
Right.
So it's like the Grand Canyon, a difference between these two pools of knowledge.
Okay, yeah, no, and I totally understand that does make sense.
You know what, Alex? In my classrooms, if somebody says, "Oh, you know, I'm answering questions, they got questions," they put their hand up, and you might even remember this. They'll say, "Well, I believe that," and I stop them cold. I stop them cold mid-sentence, and I'm saying, "Excuse me," and they're like, "Whoa, wow, you're ignorant," you know, whatever. No, you believe something. Maybe you should go down the street to divinity school. That's not why we're here. We're here to think. I think that is way different than I believe that, ... I mean, again, it's like black and white, up is down, thunder versus sun, you know, completely different things. So yeah, it is kind of an important distinction on the street. People say, you know, colloquially, yeah, I believe, you know, Alex takes too much drink on the weekend or whatever, you know, that kind of thing. We use it colloquially, but when we're trying to actually understand something that we don't understand, these terms are super important. You ever read Oregon?
Yeah, 1984, was it Animal Farm, right?
How much of that book, Alex, was about words and thought speak and using certain words? And words are really powerful. They frame what world to you. And if you can make these distinctions, then you can move forward to solve problems and so on. And there's nothing wrong with beliefs, but it's not science. I'll say one last thing on this. Maybe you want to ring a bell and get Betsy to move further down the field here, but I'll say one more thing about it. And that is the distinction is vitally important for Western-based democracies. There's never really been much debate as to the faith in, say, policies that affect whatever, this or that. It's always been based on empiricism. Recently, we see some slides into sort of belief when it comes to this stuff. And when you start down that path, you're in for some tough sledding, my friend. But anyway.
It could be a slippery slope, right? You kind of...
Not can be. It is. Many societies have done it, and they're not around. Seen a Roman lately? I haven't. They're called Italians.
Yeah. So just going back a little bit, I mean, with terms of, you know, the word evidence, what I find on, you know, these shows like Ancient Aliens, they present certain things as evidence, but it's not necessarily something you can prove. Okay, let me go with this, for instance. We talked a lot about in your class, or somewhat a little bit at least, about out-of-place objects. We could talk about specific ones, but I wanted to get your specific thoughts and details about not just the Nazca lines, but other similar type of...
oh, sure. Yeah.
I guess. Have you heard of the Intaglio, Blythe Intaglio in California? Have you heard of that? There's like some similar to the Nazca lines, like thinking like the California-Arizona border.
No.
It was on the Ancient Aliens one you were on, the most recent one with the Aztecs. I guess it's like a new discovery, but there's some new petroglyphs similar to the Nazca lines that are located in
Petroglyphs.
similar to the Nazca lines.
No, well, okay, let's back up.
Yeah.
A petroglyph is some kind of an artistic rendition or wording or whatever that's pecked into or carved into a rock.
Okay.
Like usually the face of a cave or,
Right.
some kind of a cliff or whatever, right? A piece of flat rock that you can walk up to or climb up to, whatever. And so they'll peck into that vertical or near vertical surface. The Nazca lines are not that. The Nazca lines, if you want to know what they are, what they are is a piece of the desert on the coast of Peru, which is one of the most arid deserts on the planet Earth. A piece of that desert is covered with like a kind of a smallish pebble to say golf ball size or maybe a bit bigger stone above the sort of grayish clay sand. But there's this layer of kind of like scattered stones that goes and goes on the plain there, and it's huge. And so what they were doing in ancient times, the folks who made this, is they were simply removing those stones, thus exposing in lines of various sorts the desert floor in specific patterns. So right away, that's not a petroglyph, right?
Okay.
So, but they're making a ritual, if you want to use that dirty word, and I don't like it much. But anyway, they're clearly significant pattern easily, by the way, by removing the stones that you could see from a nearby hill. And so the Nazca people, this is a culture that existed about 1500, 1600 years ago on the coast of Peru down there. And these people also lived in many communities. They were people who made pottery, who built houses, who built temples, who had sizable communities like large towns, small cities, etc. So there's a lot of archaeology that tells us about various facets, economics and household stuff and ritual and religion and so on. Anyway, so these lines were part of that sort of built environment, like a cosmogram that they would put down there on the desert floor that they could also see from elevations nearby. They're quite large, some of these designs on the desert floor. So again, the question isn't who built them. There's all kinds of archaeological information, bits of pottery, places where they lived temporarily when they were making them and so on. There's no question about any of that. But the bigger question there, the one that always gets lost when frankly tinfoil hat wearers start talking about this stuff, and the bigger question is, why'd they do them? What were the meaning of, say, harpy eagles and composite part human, part animal, and so on? They had clearly, these things are depicting stuff that was really significant to the people who made them, probably for religious reasons, animism, and so on. So these are interesting questions that come to, worldview and religion and many aspects of ancient Nazca life that people have used the desert artistic renditions to answer. So nobody is going to look at that and say, gee, is that a landing strip? That would be like me saying to you, Alex, you and I are sitting in a building in London, and the year is 1850. And there's one tiny window on the wall. We're having a beer, and we're sitting there, and it's real quiet. And all of a sudden, we hear a wagon with a horse come down the street right in front, of where we're sitting having our beer. You don't turn to me, because the street's cobblestone. You can hear that coming, right? You don't turn to me and say, gee, David, I wonder what color that unicorn is. Okay. The first thing in your mind is going to be, that's a horse coming down the road. You see the difference? You don't need to go to unicorn, right? That's faith. That's not real. That's faith-based. It's real as an empirical. So coming back to the Nazca lines with our unicorn in mind, we're not going to go from, a straightaway design that could be a landing strip from something else. These are Seike lines. If you really want me to get into the weeds, they're called Seike lines in Spanish. Actually, Nahuatl. It's the native Inca language. It'll come to me in a second. Anyway, having a brain fart. But the word Seike means a sacred line that marks things like equinoxes and other things they're observing with the North Star and places and ideas and events and so on. There's nothing unusual about marking the landscape like this. You know some other people that did this a lot? People in the English Isles. They had henges, they had cairns, they had all kinds of things on the landscape that had ritual and astronomical, cosmological, meaning there's nothing bizarre about the Aztec lines, except one thing. You ready? People trying to make them out to be something they're not. Hello, unicorn.
A couple of things I'll just say. I mean, that's, it sounds like that makes sense and it's logical. One thing I think that on the ancient aliens, side, kind of, I think there might be one particular line or kind of artistic expression that maybe shows like humanoid wearing like a helmet or so-called helmet or whatever, but I think that's just basically interpretation. There's no way to prove that. That's just...
How would you prove it out?
Yeah, so I mean, it's...
Okay, so some guy making a petroglyph puts a halo or a circle around someone's head. Okay, it's an art, or do you go unicorn and say that's a helmet on an ash tree?
Well, no, yeah, we'll get to...
Pass the opium to me before you come to that conclusion.
We'll get to a little bit later because a lot of including the recent episodes you're on of the Mysteries of the Mayans and Mystery of the Aztecs, those two recent episodes of Ancient Aliens, what I noticed is that they show you the artistic, representation either on stone or whether it's like an artwork or whatever, and they, you could see it, and if I were to look at it without watching the show Ancient Aliens, I would think it's a crown, but they say it's a space helmet. So it's an interpretation, you know what I mean? Like it's...
How about this one? Hey, Alex, how about this one? No, it's an inverted goldfish bowl. And these are people from the past who had, gravity-defying aquariums. Like, you can go anywhere with that.
Right.
Right?
One thing, too, that you mentioned, and I never really understood it, but I think I do remember you saying in class, but they claim that there's the reason that they think the aliens made it is that there's no way you could see it except from a perspective above the ground. But you mentioned, that they would climb into the higher mountains and able to see it from higher elevations, right? It's not like they were unable to get that high and look down and see him, right?
Of course. But even if they didn't, it doesn't mean that they're not capable of taking, say, something they draw on a piece of wood or whatever, and then using simple geometry and math, sticks and string, to lay that out on a larger scale so some supernatural above could see their work. They don't have to see it themselves. They don't have to do that. One thing you'll see about modern people a lot when they interpret the past, I'm not experts so much, but just lay people, they always underestimate the brain of people in past cultures. Our brain has been essentially hardwired, not hardwired, but it's been wired more or less the same for at least 50,000 years. So to put it in more narrow terms, the time that we spent doing anything other than hunting, gathering, the last 13 or 12,000, and even much less in some parts of the world, is a tiny fraction of a time frame where logic and other things were fully capable. So if you see somebody from 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, because they didn't have steel or they didn't have, iPhones or whatever, they're somehow like deficient and, blah, blah, blah. That's just a ridiculous thing. It's like thinking about us as being mentally deficient 500 years from now. Right? We are what we are, but our brain is capable of the same sorts of things. And again, people put stuff in the land all the time. We do it.
Well, it's a good point you make. Like I kind of always thought this too. I mean, for instance, like in living in this modern society, people that don't know, or like people don't think about it, we tend to like project our interpretations of life on the ancient people. But here's something that I kind of thought about too. In terms of like, on the Ancient Alien show, like Georgios Tsoukalos, the guy with the hair, or a lot of them, they'll claim, that it's, they'll claim that the Ancient Alien thing is, it's not religious, but they were like physical, the gods came down, were physical beings. And for instance, one of the things that I noticed is that they'll say in the mythology, when they talk about like flying snakes or like flying things in the sky, they'll say that the ancient people simply didn't have the knowledge of that technology, and they saw a plane and they say it was a flying snake. I think that's kind of like you're saying. I think that's kind of not giving them credit. I think that in my mind, I would be more willing to believe that if they wrote something, they actually saw that little thing, not an airplane that was a snake, an actual snake or something.
Again, hey, Alex, don't believe that little thing, end quote. Just think about that little thing. And if you think about it, that thing in the sky could be a meteor, it could be cloud formation, it could be whatever, right? And people, last I checked, unlike a Dalmatian, they look up, right? We look up in the sky. Rabbits and things don't do this. Your dog. When was the last time you saw your dog in the backyard, looking up in the sky with its paw, holding its chin up and thinking, rubbing its chin like a philosophical? They don't do this, right? People do this. And when they look up, they see things, and that becomes part of their worldview. So yeah, again, the thing that's flying through the sky, is that a unicorn or a horse? A lot of this kind of thing, by the way, is better to be sort of discussed in a bar with a pint of Guinness in your hand, right? Because it's kind of, again, it's two different paradigms. And so it's sort of fun. One of my hobbies, by the way, I shouldn't say this, but I will, since, you're in the business of entertaining people. One of my hobbies, being an expert on this kind of thing, is going to dinner parties and actually taking the two paradigms and making them wed for arguments. So I have about 10 different ways where I can get people talking about, things like creationism, get them talking about it and have the clash of the paradigms without anyone really knowing. And so I get it really revved up, and then I sort of back out and then I go to the other room and listen to people argue.
Yeah, well, sometimes with religion, like they say, it's like politics. But I wanted to come back to eventually. I definitely want to get your thoughts on later if there's like a difference between intelligent design and creationism. But just getting back to, I kind of want to push a little bit gently and see if there's any, talking about out of place objects, are there any off the top of my mind, or any that kind of just make you think or question or wonder or have no explanation, that are mysterious, where there's no, logical explanation or reason as to what they are or where they found them? Anything that,
or at least challenges it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there are some things like that, but they're very few, and they're kind of explainable in a different way. Let me start by saying that if I knew of this as a regular thing, what you're asking about,
yeah,
if this was common, this kind of thing, then I would be writing the books that you're describing. I would be doing that. But again, these things are explainable. Okay, so I'll give you an example. About, probably 60 years now, maybe 55, 60 years ago, there were some people, and I don't remember their names, but there were Mexican archaeologists that were working in and around Mexico City, and around temples and some other things, and somewhere in the basin of Mexico or near there. I don't remember exactly where, but these people found some figurine, a little figurine. Mesoamerican people made these kind of little ceramic dolls. Most cultures in the world made them at different points in the past, and Mesoamerican peoples made them, and they would them for curing and other ritual reasons. Anyway, they found a piece of one of these inside one of these temples. And the temples are built, or the buildings, any building really, they're built in sequences. They didn't rip buildings down. They would simply build on top of them. So when you find, 6 or 7 layers of buildings, and down in the earliest one, say, you find things inside there that were thrown in as, fill. When you find things down in there, they're pretty well sealed in there. They can't really get in any other way but the people at the time throwing them in there, right? Because it's below like a platform made out of stone or stucco or something, right? So anyway, these folks found this little figurine head, and it looked like a Roman figurine head. Yeah, and it dated to about, I think it was, I don't know, whatever it was, around that time or something else. Anyway, and it did look like a Roman head, but not really. Not 100%, but it kind of looked like that. But keep in mind, so now I'm going to explain the logic side. Okay. You could take that thing and go, Roman New World and revolution, whatever. Or you could say to yourself, these people made figurines by the tens of thousands or more annually, because they're regularly using for curing and breaking them and, whatever stuff, sympathetic magic. Anyway, if you make enough of these and they're hand modeled, right? They're not made in a mold. They're made with your hand. Then some of them are going to look like probably Frank Sinatra or Justin Bieber, right? It's a bit like getting 20,000 potatoes and laying them out on your driveway. One of them's going to look like Lincoln or Washington or, things, artistic style will have a variation that'll move pattern recognition in your head a certain way. Now, in order to put that question with that figurine head that looks Roman to bed, obviously you could take it and you could test the ceramic to see if it's local pottery. You can do this scientifically. But to my knowledge, it's never been done. And I don't know all the details what came, but that would be the logical style, variation in style would be the logical thing. And of course you could test that. That's the science, Alex. So you want to work with the logic, then you take another thing, another scientific thing. You ask the question, you test, and then you get a chemical result, which would back up your logic. But just simply saying it's Roman, now you're into the faith end of it, right?
That makes sense.
It's a good example. There are many like this. I shouldn't say many. There's some. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, just based on the ones I know and kind of the ones that are more popular, whatever, if you could kind of give me your kind of take on them. Have you ever heard of the Baghdad Battery? Do you know about that? I think it was discovered in like the 30s near like, in Mesopotamia, I think near like modern day Iraq and near that area. And I guess it was, I'm not sure the dates, but it was like an ancient vessel and it had like a rod, and I guess they tested the chemicals and they found that it was, if you
who's they? I mean, I can't comment on that if I don't see it. I mean, I don't know. So the short answer is no, but I've heard like there's lots of things like that out there. And then, if you have kooks doing the testing, it's going to be, it's called a priori. And I hate to throw big words, but you asked me to explain it. So it's called a priori reasoning. This is a Latin phrase that means in advance. And so this is a scientific term where people employ a priori reasoning in advance of actually doing their test. They're not experts. They think they are. They're not. So they're doing tests, and they've already got a predetermined understanding, right?
Like they
so
go into it.
Fix. Yeah.
They go into it kind of with a certain preconceived notion of what it is, right?
100%. And it's it's a human kind of it's a human kind of psychology. I mean, it's very basic. It's like cognitive dissonance, right? You have an idea and you want to sort of prove it by way of doing your, tests. And so whatever the tests are, there may be 100 and only 3 of them support what you think is the case. So you disregard all of the rest of the pieces of evidence and go with your 2 or 3 out of 100 and say, see, we've got evidence. That's the way these people operate. So I don't know about the battery, but I would bet the family farm on that it's nonsense.
Okay. What about there's more than one. It's a lot of ancient aliens, but I've heard about them before and read about them. But what about there's several kind of discoveries of these metallic stones and or kind of different stones made of different material like iron ore, metal in ancient times that are kind of unexplainable. Have you heard about any of those?
Well, they're not unexplainable. Let's get some basics down. First of all, metals come from stone, unless they're alloys, right? So that's where they come from. So there's not shocking that some stone would be heavily induced with metal. Now, if you get into alloys, an amalgam of more than one, kind of stone or metal, in this case, then that needs to be explained. So you can look at, for example, lodestones. You can look at compass things, like, for example, at the big Olmec site of San Lorenzo in 1967, the guy who was excavating there, Michael Coe, who I published with on Olmec stuff, he's now deceased, but the guy that was excavating there found a long, thin piece of I believe it was kind of a specific kind of iron ore, naturally occurring, but formed in such a manner as to make it polar, north and south, like that it could have been used as a directional unit, like a compass, right? North or something like that. And so there are examples like this, but they could have, for example, in the case I just mentioned, been carving out a long rectilinear piece of iron ore to use to make other things. And we know they used it for other things. So again, there's possibilities, and then there's probable, and then there's certain. So yeah, there are things like that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's kind of one of the, there's one other device I kind of was wondering if you heard about. It's been on ancient aliens, but I've read about it before. I guess it's called the Antikythera mechanism. It's like a ancient Greek thing that was found in a shipwreck. Have you heard about that?
Yeah, that one I saw somewhere once, so I got a chuckle out of that. I didn't analyze it. I'm not an expert in marine navionics,
Right.
but again, people have, I think this is the one that they were also calling some kind of a computer or something.
Right. They say it was like an ancient computer.
Nonsense. Yeah. So it's a device that you can, from what I gather, and again, I didn't examine it, I'm not an expert on it, but from what I gathered from reading about this, it was simply a very elaborate device you could use, partly based on cosmology, like it would be the equivalent of horoscopes and things like moving planets and stuff. Other things all movable in a multi sort of dialed sandwich device that could be used in addition to, say, what is called a sextant, 400 years ago, directional stuff and so on. Just a navigational tool that's very complex. And again, we underestimate the extent because we're modern people and we think ancient people were kind of dumb. That's what we do. I don't, but, we underestimate, generally speaking, the expertise, the mechanical capabilities, and the cultural interest that people would have in making a all-in-one device that incorporates, movements and other things into that device that you can adjust given where you are, time of the year, and so on. Yeah. So ancient computer, I don't know, drop some acid. Maybe it's an ancient computer. I didn't see a computer chip in there, right?
Yeah, I mean,
you know what, Alex? I wasn't taking opium at the time either. I might have been able to see that had I had a good dose of an opium pipe. I don't know.
Yeah, it's one of those objects that's been on a lot of those shows. They've talked a lot about it and kind of so many different theories. Going back to a little bit of what you were talking about the, Roman face and how that, your logic behind it, that kind of relates to a little bit about, or maybe you could tell me if it relates to how, or the whole topic about like those giant Olmec heads, and people kind of say that they look Africanized or something like that. Is that kind of how a little bit what you were saying in terms of that, or no?
Well, it's another example of the appropriation of culture. Right? But there's no relationship between the figurine head and the Olmec heads.
Right.
It's 2,000 years apart. But in the case of the Olmec heads, you have some people who, unfortunately, want to steal Native American heritage and claim it as their own, that they came from some, as yet never defined, but whatever, part of Africa, came over to Central America and I guess carved a bunch of stone heads and then went back or something. I don't know. But the bottom line is all of the phenotypical features of the face of these things are completely in keeping with Native American range of whatever you're looking at there. They focus on lips and nose. And anyway, the sad thing there is that the folks that talk about this, and there aren't many, again, it's just a tiny little bunch of kooks. The people who talk about this never talk about the unbelievable achievements of African civilizations. Why are you doing this? Why don't you talk about ancient Nubia or Axumites, whatever. These fantastic civilizations, and you're over there stealing the thunder of native folks? That's to appropriate, to take. And one of the worst things you can take is somebody's culture. That's just ridiculous. And anyway, the long and short of it is there's no evidence coming back to my hand over here to support any of that. Other than, again, like you said, visual kind of
right.
And interpretation, right? Patterns, right? The mind sees patterns, and we're a pattern-oriented species. If you don't have pattern recognition, you're in a world of hurt because you're probably going to walk in front of a bus, right? So we see patterns, and we do a lot of things in our minds, symbols and so on. And so we tend to see certain things, and they're explainable in many different ways, not one way, right? So anyway, that's the heads. Now, let me just end the head thing by saying to you, they're fantastic without jumping on a bandwagon of silliness in their own right. What do they mean? Why did they make them? Were they ruler portraits? Why were they defaced at the end of San Lorenzo and Olmec times? And there's a myriad of super fascinating questions surrounding the monumental sculpture of the Olmec people. It has nothing to do with whether they were from Africa, which is nonsense.
Right.
Sexy nonsense, I guess. Alluring nonsense, but not over here in the demonstrable evidence side.
Yeah. One of the reasons I'm glad that you're on it, you can talk a little longer, is because on the Ancient Alien show, the last two most recent ones about the Aztecs and the Mayans, they take clips of yours that are 30 seconds, and you get little bits. And I wanted to kind of have you expand. So one of the things that you were mentioning about in the one about the Mayans, you were kind of mentioning that the Olmecs were the previous civilization, and they're kind of referred to as the mother culture of Mesoamerica. Can you get into their timeline and who they were as a people, and kind of what you know basically from being there and kind of studying it?
Sure. The Olmec people, the reason they use mother culture is it's just a little catchphrase that means that many of the things that came to characterize all of Mesoamerica, like the ball game and the use of incense and whatever, many, many things, they seem to have an origin around that time frame, and that time frame is about 3,200 years ago, when the Olmecs at a place called San Lorenzo, where those big stone heads are, most of them are there. Those Olmecs were making these things, and so there's no rival for this kind of complex culture. The Olmecs were doing things that nobody had ever done in Mesoamerica, and in order to construct many multi-ton portraits of leaders, you have to move the rock 50 kilometers and rafts across the land, and you have to bring it up to the site. You have to have the labor to do that. You have to organize the labor to do that. There's the complexity of the cultural framework to pull all that off is astounding. And most people don't know that where those stone heads are, they are but a tiny, tiny fraction of all of the stonework. Most of the stonework were troughs, like how do I say this? An aqueduct system that ran underneath the site from a natural spring that was located near the center of this site. And so they run all over the site for ritual purposes. There's a river right next door. They didn't need to do this. And every one of these troughs, they're all connected. There's thousands and thousands of these. Each one of these would take probably maybe a half a year or something of a human's life to peck out with the technology. The labor that went into making this site, these stone things, makes the heads are just a tiny, like maybe 1% of the overall work. So the Olmecs were doing a lot of really cool things at a time when nobody else was. So, but in short order, they were in contact with other regions of Mesoamerica and things started to spread out. Hence the term mother or origin, mother culture. And the Maya, at a much later date, I said to you it was 3,200 years, the Maya around 2,800 years ago or so, they started to adopt many of those Olmec kind of things, like organizing their space and, some of the supernatural motifs and artistic things and so on that were established much earlier in Olmec times. And the Maya weren't even sedentary or village people. They were hunter-gatherers when the Olmecs were around. And later on, when they settled down. So they're later. Olmec starts around 1,200 or so BC, and then the Maya around 900 BC, they're settling down. Yeah.
Okay.
It's an interesting thing because think about Europe. Let me just 20 seconds here. Think about Europe. Think about Greek civilization, for example. And some people will talk about Hellenistic Greece and the statues and the pantheon of gods, which in many ways are still kind of with us. These things were the origin point for Western civilization, right? They talk about it being the cradle of Western civilization, philosophy, and on and on. Well, it's the same idea with the mother culture in Mesoamerica, Olmecs being that cradle.
Right. Yeah. It's very fascinating. And then in a way, like, if I'm not mistaken, you're saying like it kind of bled into like the Maya and other cultures and they kind of incorporated their practices and, the religion, everything into their culture. And it was initially the Olmecs first.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. But, like any culture that incorporates, they pick and choose, they use certain things, they modify them. But these things all kind of ultimately have, the ones that moved out, they ultimately have this origin in and around the Gulf Olmec region. Whereas this place at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, where San Lorenzo, the preeminent site, was located. So yeah, you're right, 100%. And then, they continue. There were still many of these traits, like the use of certain incenses and ball games and other things. They're still around when the Spanish show up, right? 500 years ago. They just, the Aztecs were doing many of these things, but they couldn't say, yes, I played the ball game because Olmecs they didn't even know who the Olmecs were. These things just persisted and took off in a broader, let me just say to you, the word Mesoamerica itself means an area that's defined by certain cultural practices. And a lot of them came out of Olmec times.
Right. It is just fascinating to think about that, like one of the beginning cultures for like the rest. One of the things that was really fascinating on the show, and you kind of talked a little bit about it, was in terms of the Mayans, how kind of in a way with new discoveries, they're having to kind of rethink the whole timeline. Can you tell me a little bit about El Mirador? Like, really, do they know how old it is? And tell me a little bit about like what you know. And I heard that, you can tell me if it's right or wrong, but I heard that some of the images and, pyramids that they discovered could rival that of Egypt. So is that all true? And let me know what your thoughts and kind of...
Yes, it's true.
Okay.
Yeah, it is. It's an unbelievable thing. And 40 years ago, late 70s or so, we had no idea about any of this. And so to answer this fully, we have this formative phase, developmental phase of Maya civilization that starts when they settled, when I was just talking about a minute ago, around 800 or so BC, and it ends around 200 or so AD. So a pretty long time, and it's formative. So things are, they're settling down, they're turning into chiefdoms, they're getting larger, and and so on, eventually into states. And then you get this period called the Classic period, which is what most people talk about when they talk about Maya, and it goes from 250 AD to 900. So in the last 40 years or so, that formative period has been looked at a lot closer. And one of the most remarkable things is we totally underestimated the date at which state-level societies emerged in the Maya area. And it was underestimated by 400 years. And so El Mirador is the largest of all of them. And so El Mirador gets its start pretty early, like any other little Maya tiny hamlet, at 800 BC. But by the time we get to around 300, 250 or so BC, this thing starts to build at a rapid pace. And by the time we get to the time of Christ, it's the largest Maya metropolis that was ever built. And the cool thing about El Mirador is that around 200 AD, it collapses. It's the only really mysterious Maya collapse. The collapse, the Maya collapse that people talk about, happened around 850 AD, and we kind of understand what's all about. But the El Mirador one, this is the largest site that the Maya people ever built. The largest pyramid at this site, it's called the Dante complex. There's other huge ones too, but this is the same size or bigger than the Great Pyramid in Egypt. These are freaking huge pyramids. And obviously you can't build big pyramids, many of them in an entire cityscape that's probably 20 kilometers square, the size of southern Manhattan, right? You can't do this if you're a tiny little chiefdom. These are super advanced states that are doing pretty much classic period Maya stuff, with the exception of some of the writing and other things that take off in the classic period. So El Mirador, a fantastic place, collapses, and it's a bit of a mystery. Probably drought, probably overreach, I don't know. By the way, it's also the only Maya city ever built that may have controlled most of the Maya region. We don't know this for sure, but later times there were city-states, so tiny states like the Vatican, many such states in the classic period. But El Mirador may have been what we call a regional state that controlled many parts of the Maya area. We just don't know. Super interesting stuff.
Right. And so you kind of talk about like the mystery of that particular site's, what happened to them. I kind of wanted to go back. Is there a mystery to what happened like to the Olmecs? Did their civilization kind of...
Yes, it did. Well, remember I was talking about the San Lorenzo Olmecs, right? Mm-hmm. So that's going around 1200 or so, maybe a little early. And it stops around 1000, maybe 950 BC. So it's only at its sort of large scale for about 200 to 300 years, and then it collapses. And the short answer is we don't know why it collapses, but there's some evidence for the defacing of the monuments, people gouging them and other things, and some of them were toppled probably, but that's pretty meager evidence. But there's some evidence for that kind of thing, which may be social disruption in some way. You could think of it like revolution or whatever, but there could be something like that. Or remember I told you they were sending out stuff to other, they're the mother culture.
Right.
Some of their ideas are adopted, like maybe corn and other things. And they just simply, the seeds of their own demise were built into them, because the things that made them unique, that made them powerful, everyone else over the next couple centuries, they get it And all of a sudden, they're not the only show in town. There's competing things and they sort of fall down economically or whatever. We don't know. That's another thing. But when they do collapse around 950, there's a 50 to 75 year or so hiatus. There's nothing really going on. And then the next big Olmec site starts. It's called La Venta. And La Venta goes from around, say, 5900 or so BC all the way down to about 300 BC. And so La Venta partially overlaps with the early state development in the Maya area. You can see how they would sort of, influence and know of each other and so on.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. That like kind of a little bit of like interaction and like overlap between the two.
A lot. Yeah.
Right.
One thing we also always underestimate is the extent to which ancient people were interacting. They've always done it. Did you know that there are people that are buried at Stonehenge in England that are from what today is Switzerland?
Yeah, well, that's fascinating.
4,000 years ago, there were people from what today is Switzerland living in England and died and were buried there.
Yeah.
People moved around a lot.
See, it's a fascinating point, but like kind of taking a step further, you don't necessarily subscribe to certain theories that like other ancient civilizations or cultures reached the Americas because there's no evidence for it, right? It's all based on like physical.
Well, there's no, and I would have a trumpet on the roof of my house and sell 1 million books if that was the case. It's just there's no evidence for it.
Have you ever heard of? I think it's been a while, like maybe a couple decades, but have you ever heard of the book called America BC by Harvard professor Barry Fell? He kind of had the whole idea. People said he was crazy, but he had the idea that like a lot of cultures came to the Americas, the Vikings, the Romans, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, like a lot of ancient Hebrews. So he had a whole theory of that, but you obviously don't.
Well, I can without slamming him personally, I can dismantle that fairly quickly. There's a thing, you have, let's say, a pyramid in Mexico, and you have pyramids in Egypt and many other places, whatever. You got pyramids in what today is Mexico and Central America, other parts of Central America. So, again, it begs the question, if the ones in, say, Africa are a little older than the ones in Mexico, then maybe some people from Africa or wherever came over and sort of, helped that. Or it could be lost tribes of Israel coming here, or whatever, right? Contact, transoceanic contact. And that's a legitimate question that we can address. But before we address it, it's interesting to think about sort of the unicorn and the horse. And so there's two ways of addressing questions about, transoceanic stuff. And it comes down to another boring term, but I'll give it to you anyway. It's called parallel evolution. And so the parallel evolution is a concept that explains how people in different parts of the world can come up with similar ideas, cultural practices. People in Egypt, people in wherever, right? I'll just use Egypt because people know that one. In Egypt and people in what today is Mexico, they both have pyramids. And so, wow, how can we explain that? Well, the concept of parallel evolution allows us to do it. So here it comes. All right, you ready? Let's take pyramids. We have pyramids in Egypt. We have pyramids in Mexico. If part of your religion, wherever you live on the planet Earth, involves creating an artificial mountain to raise you closer to the gods, the supernaturals, you want a platform to perform your religious things on, right? So you build a platform, and then you have some more labor, you build it higher, and whatever. You know the drill. It gets bigger, right? So people in Egypt will do that. People in the Americas, and by the way, many, many other places, will do this without being in contact. How can we be sure of that, Alex? Well, here's how. Parallel evolution. If you take a bunch of rocks, you can do this if you go to Home Depot on the weekend. Try this. Don't take your parents' car, though. You'll wreck it. Take their car, get a bunch of gravel, stone, and bring it back to their house or your house, and start piling it in the backyard with a shovel and see if you can make a nice square building. Do that. Can you pile dirt or gravel or stone in a formation that's nice and square? Can you do that?
Probably not, yeah.
The answer is physics won't allow you, Alex. Okay, so what do you need to do if you want to take the stone and make it vertical? Well, you got to, tier it or whatever. It's got to come in, right? You can throw dirt in and it'll just form in a natural cone, or gravel. It'll form in a cone. And ultimately, this is what people were doing. They were forming stuff into big piles to make an artificial mountain, a temple, whatever you want to call it. And they didn't have, here it comes, Alex, rebar. When you have cement and rebar, you can make arches and other things that allow you to move away from an ascending side into vertical sides. It's simple technology and physics. So, can we explain people using platforms in Egypt and in Mesoamerica by simple logic and physics without any contact? I just did it for you. I did it.
Evolution?
Yeah. So think about two cultures as two lines parallel to each other. They're never in contact, yet they have the same things, right? They're going along parallel. They don't even know of each other and through time. Now, if one culture comes in contact with the other one and shares that thing, like Olmecs with Zapotecs or whatever, then they're no longer parallel. They intersect. It's called culture contact, right? So there are most things that are transoceanic, all of them are parallel evolution. In other words, cultures can evolve and change. That's a dirty word, but they change and they'll adopt things like pyramids. You know what? If you're on a road in barefoot in Egypt and there's sharp stones, or you're in what today is Michoacan and there's sharp stones, there's a high chance you're going to invent a thing called shoes so your feet don't hurt, right? You don't need transoceanic contact to know that your feet are sore, right?
Yeah, no.
You see the logic built into this?
Yeah, definitely.
Fun too.
No, it makes sense.
Every time I do Ancient Aliens, I go through the similar routines like that, and they all laugh and they say, well, that's great, but too bad we can't use.
I definitely want to get into like the behind the scenes part of that a little bit, but because I have you on and you're like, you've been an expert in those cultures of the Mayans and the Aztecs and Olmecs, I wanted to, even though it's been 13 years, I wanted to get your, I'm sure I know what you're going to say kind of, but I want to get your thoughts and details about the whole misunderstanding of the Mayan calendar in 2012. Like, can you explain to people kind of, if I'm not mistaken, that was not the end, their calendar is very sick.
Yeah, you know what? I should have capitalized on that, Alex. I blew it. I could have started a little cult and got people to use, you ready? Belief and faith in what my expertise is telling them. And I could have probably started a religion there and banked a cool $1 million tax-free, but I didn't, idiot that I am. Anyway, so what is 2012? The Maya had a system of counting in units that are what we call vigesimal. They're not decimal. They're in units of 20. And so one of the largest units is in 400. And every so often, these things called Baktun, which is these large units, like a century or so. Nice. Every so often, these things will come around, and the Maya people would talk about cycles of time, right? They talk about cycles of time being a rebirth. And this is simply the 2012 date was the end of one Baktun and the start of another Baktun. The Maya people have never stopped. Indigenous Maya people have never stopped counting in a vigesimal way. They still do it. Maya people, right? In small villages in the highlands of Guatemala and so on. They still know our calendar and all that. But anyway, the current one came to an end in 2012 and the new one was going to start. So people, right? Unicorn, not horse. People thought, hey, they're talking about a rebirth, the end of times and the beginning of it, which they were in the Maya sense of end of times, rebirth of a new cycle of time. So people got kooky. They went unicorn and started talking about the end of the world. And so I've just explained it to you. It's a bit like, not quite, but it's a bit like the Y2K thing.
Yeah.
You might remember that. I don't know if you're old enough.
Yeah, I remember.
It's the same garbage, except in this one, they're stealing another culture's narrative and twisting it to meet some kind of tinfoil hat understanding of the world.
It was interesting. I mean, I remember the Y2K and the 2012, and it was just so interesting to hear people's these doomsday prophecies and the movie, and it's just like it in a way, if you believed it, you could find yourself panicking. But
Sure. How old were you?
well, I'm 43 now, so yeah, I was 20 years ago,
5 years.
Yeah.
Oh, you remember this?
Yeah.
You were a teenager. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I went to a party that night, and I remember I was at the party, and this person, a friend of my wife's, was had done all this preparatory stuff and watering the closet and backup batteries, and it's like I'm like, what? Another missed economic opportunity, Alex. I could have wedded Y2K with 2012.
I think some people did do that, if I'm not mistaken, like around the turn of the century. So I wanted to ask, okay, so we have the Mayans and the Olmecs. I got to ask you about the Aztecs. So, I mean, if we can go into their timeline, and then a lot about their mythology, and I specifically wanted to ask you your thoughts and kind of just explanations about their religion and why they did the human sacrifices, like what the whole meaning behind it were, and like what your take on all that, their mythology and that whole practice was.
Well, they had a mythology that demanded human sacrifice. So you kind of answered your own question there, but they had to go a little deeper into it. They had an origin myth of they came to the Valley of Mexico. The Mexica people, who were the core part of the Aztec. The Aztec is not a real group of people. It's like a bunch of different ethnic groups. Anyway, the Mexica people arrived from the north, from this mythical place. It doesn't really matter, but part of that whole process of moving south and eventually arriving in the Valley of Mexico, say 750, 800 years ago, involved somebody's sacrifice and so on. So in any case, in the Mesoamerican tradition, human sacrifice was to appease gods and so on. And so they took it to a pretty elaborate level. They were doing a lot of it. But it's interesting because they needed to do it for religious reasons. I'm not justifying, I'm just explaining it. They did it for religious reasons, and many of the people who were actually, not many, but some anyway, of the people who were actually sacrificed were Aztec people from the city of Tenochtitlan, which was Mexica and other ethnic groups. So there was an element of the sacrifice that was willing, that it was a high position to be one of these people that periodically walked those stairs and had their chest open and their heart pulled out while it was beating. That was a pretty magnanimous way to go. So it's essentially a religious thing. The idea of doing rituals that involve some kind of body modification, or even an extreme one like this, is not I guess it's sort of rare, like the extreme version here with the Aztec, but not really. Think about renewal, death, life, and so on. These are really common. You can go into the Bible, into the Old Testament, and you will see Hebrew discussions of sacrifice. It doesn't involve people, but you will see Hebrew discussions of sacrifice where they had special prayer tents and then a special altar, and they would file freaking oxen in there, Alex, like just by the scores. They'd bring them in and they kill them, and they were piled up on the altar, and they'd be burning them on the altar and so on. Like, the sacrifice it's a pretty common thing. The Aztecs did not eat people they sacrificed. They didn't do it for sadistic reasons or anything like that. It's a religious mandate by supernatural beings that, essentially in plain English, will allow the corn to grow and the world to keep going around if you do what's necessary based on that mythology.
Right.
Yeah.
the whole topic of, the history and behind the Aztecs and human sacrifice, it's very fascinating. To me, it's also kind of terrifying in a way if you were living there and kind of maybe just putting my modern perspective on it. I find it to be
For sure.
terrifying. But I wanted to ask you a couple things. First is I want to know if you have done any research or know anything about in these sacrifice rituals. Do you know if there's any research or have you read anything about how they were also using hallucinogens during these rituals as well? Do you know anything about that?
Oh, you live in the least drugged time on the planet Earth, my friend, barring the pharmaceutical companies, and I'll just let that go because you're going to put this online. But there is in prehistory and history, it's just full of people using drugs. Full, and when I mean full, I mean full. There are whole books that talk about how Greeks and Romans were like just incredibly high on hemlock and other stuff. It's just like wickedly high. But when you're learning about Plato in grade 7 or 8, I guess it's the teacher doesn't want to tell you that Plato and other aristocrats and scientists were wired out of their freaking minds when they were doing a lot of this stuff. But yeah, it's rampant. So you have all cultures doing this. In the case of Aztec, there's a bit of debate as to what kind of drugs they were using. Like there were certain, you can get stuff out of maguey and other fibrous plants that, produce alcohol. So the primary drug, and it's a drug, choice would be alcohol, and they would have other ones too, but you would have alcohol as the main one, and they would create these drinks of alcohol, and the Maya did this too, and sometimes would even take it anally in a way it's called balche, where you push the alcohol into your rectum so it absorbs really quickly, because it's not about getting borracho, Andre. It's about getting to an altered state. This isn't recreational drug use, and that's the most important point. It's about an altered state of mind, an altered state of consciousness beyond normal, right? And that's always conditioned by the needs of religious and supernatural things in the culture. So yeah, it's freaking rampant.
Very interesting. That's so fascinating. And I have heard about the Greeks and different ancient cultures using substances, hallucinogens and
man, woman, and child.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's across the board.
In a way, now that you kind of mentioned it, I mean, in your opinion, or kind of if you had to kind of put the ancient alien kind of theory in a different way, and kind of the way I would think about it that makes sense to me is, instead of saying that it's some other outer worldly beings coming here, maybe because we know that in these rituals they did these or use these hallucinogens and other chemicals, maybe it makes more sense that the gods and their religion was basically part of that whole hallucination, or, some sort of, in other words, it was like they were on a DMT or trip and that was their religion in a way. And it wasn't necessarily something physical, it was more metaphysical, where they were hallucinating and
sure.
under the influence of drugs.
You can look at it that way. It sounds like you're in a commune in 1968, but the bottom line is the drugs are a conduit to get them to supernaturals. It's again, I'm going to throw some terms here. It's called soul loss. So the people will take hallucinogenic drugs not because they're into DMT, it's not, like people listening to the White Album in 1968, right? This is about using the substance to create out-of-body altered state so you can communicate and then come back and deliver to your community or your family or whatever scale this is happening at. You're delivering this information to people. So that's what it's all about. It's not about tripping. It's about information. And that information is vital because these are pre-industrial, pre-Renaissance societies that are relying upon information like this for decision making. Right? So it's a very practical and religious thing. These were never, religion and politics were never separated in these societies. The people that did this kind of thing at a high level would be doing it to inform, to create knowledge from which decisions could be made and so on. But this also occurred right down at the household level. People got high, Alex.
Yeah, no, it's definitely fascinating. And I've read books about like, intoxication in the ancient world. And it's fascinating. It's kind of cool to think about.
Properly titled book too, because they're not intoxicated. They're enlightened. You know what I mean? And they're enlightened not because Teletubbies isn't on and it's Friday night. They're enlightened because they want to and need to communicate with God. So to answer the question you asked me a moment ago, could a lot of the artistic renditions and seemingly bizarre artistic and monumental and sculptural and so on, things that have come to us by preservation, be related to altered states and drug use? You bet your freaking sweet nerd they are. 100%. Not all of them, but some of it would be related to that. There's all kinds of figurative art where you see snot in people's nose coming out in bulbs. It's because they're taking hallucinogenic snuff and they're getting really high. And in that state, they're doing something and people are depicting that in clay or stone. And that's an important thing because it's like somebody making a decision on the stock market. It's important. It's their culture.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting to think about. Just because we're talking about the Mayans and I know you're an expert, did you ever see the movie Apocalypto? And if so, is that realistic? What's your opinion? I mean, was it a realistic portrayal?
Well, some of it is.
Some of it
is,
Do you think that that it was over exaggerating the violence and the
Yes.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
And
there were several things in there that were done for artistic reasons and whatever. It's a movie. Who cares, right? But one of them was, they had people rolling down the street. Well, I remember one scene, they had people with battle axes that were like right out of the Middle Ages, like you'd see in like a castle in Scotland in the year 200 AD, and they're chopping people's heads off. It's like, good God. Anyway, yeah. And people are rolling down the pyramids. No, the Maya didn't do anywhere near the kind of sacrificing that Aztecs did at a later date. And keeping in mind the Aztecs are much later than the Maya, right?
Right.
So no, they weren't doing that. So that's an exaggeration. But hey, it brings people to the box office, and the movie making business is a business.
Right.
The other thing that was off there was they always were running. If you remember, they were running through the forest. Kind of was like a Steve McQueen car chase going on there. They're running through the forest, and there was no forest. These people cut down all the forest. They collapsed in part. The society collapsed in part because they cut down all their forests. Right. It looked like Ohio farmscape, in the classic period. So them running through forests is, I don't know, like monkeys around. I guess it's romantic or something like that. And then the big kicker, of course, was at the end when the Spanish showed up. And I'm sitting there and thinking, gee, I should have taken some DMT. I might understand the end of this movie. But no, that was off by 500 years.
Right. They had the timing off for that one, right?
No. Yeah. So, hey, it's entertainment. You know what else is entertainment?
The ancient aliens.
Ancient aliens.
Yeah.
Some product, right? And unfortunately, there's a lot of suckers who think it's real. And whatever, right? No skin off my back. I'm going to live and die. But it's easy enough if you talk to somebody who can logically work through this and who understands what material culture is and how it varies and how it's interpreted and how we dig it up and blah, blah, all that boring stuff that doesn't sound very sexy in a 20-second clip on TV. That's what we do. My dream is to have a debate with some of the people on that show or any other show, frankly.
Well,
that gets at, this idea of what we're talking about. Right?
That's kind of one of the kind of distinctions and kind of things is like, for instance, okay, so and I already know you're really kind of against the ideas of Graham Hancock, but do you make a distinction?
No, you misunderstand me. I'm not against them. Hey, Graham, have at it. I hope you buy a second boat and you have a cottage somewhere. It's all cool. He's got a job. He's doing what he's doing. He's selling a narrative that he probably knows is fake. I don't care. Live and let live. So I'm not what you said, Derek. But I think it's sort of funny, and people want to either A, be entertained, or B, be seduced by that hand that has belief rather than the hand that has empirical stuff. Good luck, man. How about it?
Okay, so we're talking about like Graham Hancock. So here's one of the I don't know if you, I mean, in my mind, and kind of, I'm not, again, belief, but to me, if I was looking at it kind of from a outside perspective, I would kind of say that the idea, even though what you said I understand, but I would kind of say that the idea of like human beings from a lost civilization would make more sense to me than some alien beings. But I want to know specifically about what you think about the whole idea of, I don't know if you heard of Graham Hancock and the other expert he's working with, Randall Carson. He's like in the geology of like the Younger Dryas. Do you know anything about that? And can you talk about the Younger Dryas impact theory?
No, I can't, because I'm not a geologist. And anyone that's working with him is either working with him for the short term to give him some information that's going to be subsequently twisted, or they're nuts. One of the two, right? So, they're legit and they're being, they're performing a job or whatever, or they're part of selling the book. I don't know, which frankly doesn't make them nuts. It just makes them businessmen, right? So to answer your question more broadly, if you invoke, as he does, I think, and I don't follow his work because I got better things to do, like, I don't know, cut my toenails, okay? But if you follow the logic there, and there's some culture that nobody knows about, or worse, that we're hiding in some, distant past, that's responsible for this or that we're just, hiding the truth on, or some nonsense along that line, then okay, that's a good question. All right, let's run with that. Now I'm going to bring my ugly hands back up, Alex. Let's believe that there's some culture that might have been responsible for this or that. And, there's some geology here that some people say blah, blah, whatever. And then over here, you got all the actual evidence. Where's the culture? What is the material evidence beyond your supposition over here? Where is it? What is the radiocarbon date? Where are the people? Where are their habitations? Where, what? It's like peeling away the curtain and blowing the magician's surprise, right? When you start asking questions. So yeah, there are things that can be sort of interpreted. We've already covered this ground in different ways. One of the classic ones that I think but again, I don't know, because I'd sooner read a Betty Crocker cookbook, right, than his stuff. But I think one of the things he was in on was, is the Sphinx in Egypt really like whatever, so old? And I think he was one of the pseudoscience people that was in on that. And it's just, okay, there's tunnels underneath it. He's making all these assertions. And well, what are you talking about? Okay, so this is a good one, because I've actually been under the Sphinx.
Yes, yeah.
I did a TV show in Egypt, and there's one tunnel that some looters did around the arse end of the Sphinx, and they kind of dug underneath, and about 20 feet or something like that. Other than that, it's solid rock.
Just blood.
There are no tunnels. There's no tunnels. So, this has all been ground penetrated, and, there's science that can be used to see if there's openings and whatever. It's just garbage. It's nonsense. But again, Alex, if you got a winning formula and you're taking something that's kind of sort of interesting in a mysterious way and only looking at a little bit of information and ignoring everything else, hey, you may sell 100,000 books. Do the math, Alex.
Yeah, I know. I think there's definitely, like you said, everyone's trying to earn a dollar, and it's capitalism, so you can't blame people for that. One thing I will say is...
Well, I kind of do, but whatever. Yeah.
One thing I will note and say is the whole idea of like the Sphinx. I think there's one main doctor of geology. His name's Robert Schoch, and I don't think he necessarily even agrees with Graham Hancock, but I think it's really interesting. I would love to hear you debate him, because he basically is geology expert, and he pretty much is not claiming anything about aliens, but he basically says that specifically, and he has been to Egypt, and like I've heard interviews with him and seen pictures, but he basically says that there's certain parts of the Sphinx enclosure that geologically prove that it was eroded by water, and like the dates in that when that water was there to erode it would have been thousands of years ago. So how do you kind of explain that, or what are your thoughts about that?
I agree with him.
Okay, so
I mean, that's how geological layers are formed. They're formed by accumulation, compression, water erosion, and so on. So just let me carry this through. So all of that forms and forms and forms, and you've got a flat rock area. And then at some point, somebody comes along and carves that thing out of the accumulated layers. How would you test the actual carving of the accumulated layers? Do you see the logic? And it's a really important logic. It's a subtractive process to carve the stone in such a way to make that. You discard the other stones. So the only stone of interest would be the final layer at the top, because that would be the last one accumulated that could be in time that you start digging down into. Do you see the logic there? It's an extremely important point that I'm making.
I'm just still trying to follow. Can you, like, okay, so if I kind of re-explain it, and I want you to re-explain that. Because
if, Alex, you got a cake, it's your birthday, it's on the table in your kitchen, you're going to eat the cake. Is it possible to get it's an 8-layer cake? Are you going to get down in the bottom? Can you carve the cake without, by getting into the bottom, in the center? You have to start at the top. The top was the last layer of the cake. So that's the most recent layer of the cake. So that layer is the terminal date at which they commenced digging down. Now let's consider what that layer is. It's desert clay, it's stone. That, of course, is very old. It's way older than the starting point for them to start digging it out. So any geological information like that, it doesn't pass the smell test of logic. It's not about geology. It's about the subtractive nature of making the thing out of the geological layers. Does that make sense?
In a way, kind of. So if I can kind of rephrase it for like a layman, you're saying basically like, so this guy's saying that their weather erosion and water erosion in the like parts of the Sphinx show that it's much older because it took thousands of years for that to go. But you're saying you can't look at that. You have to look at just what was like what the actual carving of the Sphinx and not anything around it, because obviously there was that.
Well, there's nothing around it. It's subtractive. Removal. They're removing stone to create. This thing was dug out of flat, solid stone, right? So they're digging down and they're exposing the stone to make this thing, right? It would be like carving a little sphinx out of the center of a bar of soap, right? You have to dig down through the top. And the last layer of soap is the top. So that's the only layer of interest. Of course, all of the layers underneath are going to show erosion and water and stuff, because that's how geological layers form. They form naturally through natural processes. Make sense?
It kind of does make a little sense. Although I gotta say, for someone who's not a scientist, hearing this geologist kind of explain it, and he was very more articulate, and it made a lot of sense. He didn't agree with Hancock, but he basically was trying to make he was trying to make the argument that due to what he saw in terms of the water erosion, he speculated that it meant that the Sphinx was carved, at the point in time in history when there was water in this area, which is, I think, 10 or 12,000 years ago or something.
There was. The water was only about 100 yards in front of the Sphinx. Today, the Sphinx looks at a Kentucky Fried Chicken 24 hours a day, right across the street. But the water was once there. There was a canal that came over to that area. So again, yeah, there's no mystery there. And I guarantee you, if I read the geologist's paper, I would actually agree with them. And the only place I would probably disagree is if he's making the assumption that the last layer on the top would date the time frame that they dug the pyramid, because that last layer could have sat there for 10 or 20,000 years before they started to dig it. Layers take a long time to form.
You know, I think that'd be a great, if not debate, discussion between you and Robert Schock. I think it definitely be something worth, you know, if you're
I'd have
interested,
to read, I'd have to read it and so on. But yeah, I mean, there's again, my other hand, right? Empirical information, logic, and so on, rather than just, oh, that layer is so old, there's some water erosion on it. I guess the Sphinx is much older than ancient Egypt, which is nonsense because the Sphinx is carved in a style identical to ancient Egypt in early dynastic times. Early dynastic times. And that is the son of Khufu, the guy who built the damn big pyramid. We have all kinds of art showing Khufu's face. That is a picture of Khufu, the Sphinx. It's part Khufu and part feline, you know, like a...
You know, there's been a lot of talk, and I already know how you feel, but like with the whole notion of Atlantis and Plato, and, you know, for people that don't know, I think it's a very good point. And people have to realize that when he wrote it, if you could correct me if I'm wrong, Atlantis was never meant to be a physical place. It was more like an allegory, right?
No, man. No. This is one of the coolest things on the planet Earth. When he was talking about this and 700-800 years before Christ, this is early in Greek times. And when he was talking about this, he was referring to a mythical place. But again, this is our use of the word mythical. Okay. So he was talking about this place called Atlantis, and he was describing everything that was going on, high culture and so on. What a great place. And that's the source of this and blah, blah, blah. He was describing something mythological in the same way people would in the Bible describe ancient Jerusalem. He was talking about a real place in mythical terms. This is why people have always looked for Atlantis, okay? And now why do I say this? Because there's an island in the Mediterranean near Greece, near Crete, and it's called Santorini. It's an island that looks like a sea, and the center is blown out. It used to be a volcano. And on that island, there are Minoan ruins. The Minoan culture was like 1300 BC, way before the Greeks. And it was on Crete, but this other island of Santorini has Minoan ruins on it. It was a sea trading culture, really advanced culture. And so at one point, this volcano on the island of Santorini blew up, destroyed everything, everybody, everything on this island. And so you can see how mythology would pick up about an advanced civilization that sunk into the ocean, that was destroyed. And so you can see how this works. Now, do we know that the island of Santorini, which is what its current name is, do we know that that is definitely Atlantis for sure? And do we know no, we'll never know for sure, but it's the likely candidate that would be part of that advanced civilization that predates the Greeks, that was really magnificent, that really, and I mean really, catastrophically came to an end. So yeah, there's a logical candidate out there. Minoan Greek.
I have heard I think there's several books written about how that could be a possible inspiration for Plato's Atlantis. But also in that same line of thinking, what do you think, or what are your thoughts about the other so-called, sides of the world where they have, legends about like Mu and Lemuria? I mean, is there any basis to anything that, to those type of...
Well, I don't know. You mean like Sasquatch type things?
No, not, I mean, kind of, if you know what you think about like Atlantis, there's versions of it like in the Pacific, they call it Mu or Lemuria, like basically...
Yeah, I'm familiar with that, but I didn't know if you wanted to get into like legends. But of course there are. But this one, like there's a grain of truth, allegorical truth in what Plato and others wrote about. Just like if you look at the Bible again, people are more familiar with this, so this is what I'll mention. If you look at the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's all kinds of fact in here. There's places, there's battles, and this is not make-believe. but there's mythological tales and lessons, cultural lessons that came out of that then get sort of put in a mythological framework and so on. But there's an element of truth that underlies it. So in this case, like many others, they're kind of loosely based on truth. The Great Flood myth in the Bible, another example. This is Sumerian. It comes out of Sumerian times, and in those days there was a text of the Gilgamesh,
Right. Epic of Gilgamesh.
in which they talked about flooding and people. It's the same story, so it probably references periodic flooding on the Tigris and Euphrates River. So most mythology, lasting mythology, is based on a truth that then gets suited to cultural purposes. That's what mythology really is, and it supports worldviews and gives people frames of reference and so on. So if Santorini goes the way of the dodo in the Mediterranean, why did it go the way of the dodo? Now you get into the mythology. Oh, they were decadent, or I don't know the stories, but whatever. He's saying, but it's a volcano, so the truth is it went down. Yeah, it's super interesting. There's some truth to a lot of this stuff.
Yeah,
Not
fascinating.
true, we'll leave truth to divinity school, but there's some fact, there's some logical things in the background to a lot of these twisted interpretations.
Right. No, it's very fascinating to kind of think, because there's people that doubt it all, but now realizing that it's a little bit more complex and there's little bits of truth than they base the mythology off of and stuff. So, one thing I wanted to ask you is, if you know anything about the mystery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, or Karahan Tepe, and those new discoveries within the past 20 years, but how they say it's forcing everybody to rewrite the history of like how it didn't necessarily begin with the...
Well, it's not forcing anyone to do, it's not forcing anyone to do anything. It's interpreting the archaeological record. This site, they think, this isn't for sure yet, they think that this site dates to a time frame in the area that predates sedentism. In other words, these are hunter-gatherer times prior to people settling down with wheat and so on, becoming farmers. And so you're dating to a time frame just before that. So that's super interesting. Now, if that's true, let's just run with that dating for a second. It does predate sedentism. If that's true, then the issue becomes, why would hunter-gatherers invest such an inordinate amount of labor to making something like this? That's very unlike hunter-gatherers, because it's very difficult in an egalitarian society to kind of get people to work together. You can't order them to do things, right? So there's different kinds of questions that come out of that are bona fide, if indeed the dating and the radiocarbon dating holds. That'll unfold probably in the next 30 years. So the questions aren't really about, ooh, blah, blah, blah. There are examples on the planet Earth of people that are hunter-gatherers. They have no permanent architecture. They move around the landscape. They subsist off the landscape, etc., in a seasonal round, right? And there are examples, though, of peoples that are hunter-gatherers putting investment of their time to make cool stuff like that. Not necessarily as labor-intensive as Göbekli Tepe, right? Not necessarily that labor-intensive, but they're there. The largest mounds in South America, for example, on the coast of Peru, date to pre-ceramic times. We have no idea who made them. Well, the local people made them, but why they would do this when they're fisher, hunter-gatherer people. It's really interesting. These aren't unknown. So that's the answer to that. Something that's still getting fixed up,
In a way, it kind of relates to what you were mentioning earlier, how like we underestimate these people. So would it, or I guess what I'm trying to ask you is, due to these kind of discoveries, does it make people, or does it make, the researchers rethink of what hunter-gatherers were and kind of like...
Oh, you nailed it, my friend. That's exactly what it does. It challenges the scientific understanding, and if we can interpret it based on real evidence, as now hunter-gatherers can be a little more complex if, say, they have a stable fishery or something in the absence of agriculture and all that. So yeah, it creates a different kind of hunter-gatherer. So we're learning through evidence, we're learning about the variability in these categories of our existence on the planet. It's super fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. This was a discovery that I looked up, and it's real, and I kind of wanted to get your thoughts, or if you know anything about it, but it was featured on one of the episodes of Graham Hancock's show in America's about the discoveries in White Sands, New Mexico. There's footprints, I guess, they found in layers of rock that they're debating whether it was way older than they previously thought. Have you heard about that or know about the discovery?
In fact, I did. I read an article the other day on this. It's funny you asked me, like about 2 weeks ago. I saw the news story, so I followed it through. And so, of course, the issue comes down to their footprints.
Human footprints, right?
Correct. They're human footprints. So the issue comes down to, how do you date them? Right? Frankly, that's the only issue.
Right.
How do you date the footprints? So the devil is always in the details. A footprint isn't dateable simply because it's there. You have to get, again, I'm going to, use some terms, but you have to date it by association with something else, something near it, the mud under it, something in the mud, whatever, by association with the stuff around it. And when you start to do that, you get into a lot of problematical things because it's secondary evidence. So it can be suggestive, it can even be somewhat persuasive, but it needn't be conclusive, and seldom is when it's by association. So to get back to the footprints, super interesting to see hunter-gatherer footprints that are quite old, apparently. But am I convinced by the dates? No, I'm not. And people came across the Bering Strait around 15 to 13,000 in different times in there because of the height of the Pacific Ocean. It was low at certain points. And they came across the Bering Strait, Alaska, Russia, and down what would have been a ice-free corridor along the Pacific coast and also through British Columbia. And there's good evidence in the corridors and other sites. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sites. So there's no site anywhere that dates to that time frame that they're alleging on the basis of somewhat, not somewhat, but dates that can be interpreted different ways. So if there's no sites anywhere that date to 33,000 years ago, and you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sites that cluster in around the start, the earliest ones, then we're into unicorn versus horse again. You see the logic here?
So in other words, you're saying basically you're looking for like corresponding independent evidence, meaning if there was evidence, or like if they say these footprints of human beings are, let's say they say that 33,000 years old, you're saying if that's true, there would be evidence of like sites and other,
there should be something. Correct. There should be something, but maybe it hasn't been found yet. I mean, they might say something like that, but until such time as it is found, you go with probability, not myths or beliefs, right? Again, it comes down to the dating. So they're old footprints, but how old are they? We can't be certain because we have to date by association, right? And that brings up all kinds of taphonomic, a big word, but how things change, and geological, all kinds of other issues because of the dating. It's just by association. So again, is that an intriguing date? Sure. Would it be something that we could go back to understand maybe sites 20, 30 years ago that we find that are maybe 20 or 22 or 30,000 years ago? Sure. But in the meantime, Occam's razor, the most logical conclusion, is the one that we use. And in this case, we have a lot of sites, and at the earlier time frame of 15 or 14 or 13, and that's what they date to. There's nothing earlier.
So it sounds like, if I'm not mistaken, it sounds like you have an open mind to kind of if there's evidence that comes forth at a later period that you're really,
Always. Of course.
um,
Of course, man. Let's say near those footprints, somebody's building, I don't know, a Target or something, okay? 10 years from now, and they find an encampment of hunter-gatherers, and people go and there's actual fire pits, and there's food remains, and there's, there's stuff. They're using this campsite. And the fire and the fish and the remains and the deer bones and so on can all be directly radiocarbon dated, and they correspond with the footprints. I'm on board, 100%. But that's not the way it is right now. You have to go on a sort of an article of faith. So I'm open to anything. I'm open to transoceanic. I'm open to anything. I'm just open most of all to evidence and logic, critical thinking.
yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that's, true scientists, and that's kind of, the basis of what we
It's
study.
fun.
Real quick, I wanted to ask you, okay, so how much do you know about like astro archaeology? And I wanted to specifically ask you about the sites in Mexico, the pyramids, and also in ancient Egypt. When they make these claims on these shows, or when you read about how like these pyramids or these sites were aligned to certain stars, the Belt of Orion or the Pleiades, whatever, how much of that is true? Do you know, or can you explain that?
Well, okay. You know where you are right now? Right in the studio, where you're sitting, your chair. In fact, the big toe of your right foot, you can take a line and you can draw it from your big toe straight to the front of the pyramid in Egypt. Does that mean there's some special alignment between you and the pyramid? I don't know, Alex. You tell me. You don't look like an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, right? You see the logic there? You can do anything with a single line. Okay, so having said that, are they aligned with key things like the North Star, the Big Dipper? Did they understand north, south, and so on, and build according to cosmograms that are oriented towards the stars, specifics? You bet you. Incredibly accurate. 100%. But if I tell you that there's a line from the front of the pyramid that goes up to Jupiter, we can draw a line all the way from Jupiter to the front of the pyramid. Does that mean people from Jupiter made the pyramid? Or did Alex's big toe, because it's aligned with the pyramid, did Alex make the pyramid? No. But yeah, there's significant cosmological interest. It's not surprising. They understood the movement of basic planets, basic stars. The Egyptians invented the horoscope, man. There's a horoscope, like the one you see in a newspaper, or used to before newspapers went the way of the rapid, stupid information. The horoscope there's horoscopes that match that Greek-Roman tradition in Egypt on the top of tombs in the Valley of the Kings. People were always interested in these things.
Yeah. So real quick, just a couple of things, but I wanted to ask you, so you, as an archaeologist and like from someone who has that perspective, you've been doing it and you're an expert. One of the main things that people that really maybe aren't experts in it, I think they're convinced by is that, they say all these ancient cultures from like, you name it, the Greeks, the Mayans, all the ancient cultures, Egyptians, they were all basically very skilled astronomers. So if you could, for layman in simple terms, how do you explain?
No, well, you're kind of wrong there. Let me explain what they were.
Sure.
They were astrologers. They were keen observers, and they were accumulating that information for cosmological purposes. They weren't doing it for astrophysics. They weren't astronomers. They were, the closest word you can get in English would be astrologers. They were using it for mapping this stuff and building it into their environments and so on. All these cultures did, well, all, but many did it. Aztecs, Mayas, Egyptians, and so on. They were doing this and orienting their buildings and all this because that was the cosmology was built into their religion. So they weren't doing it for scientific reasons. Yes, they recorded it, but their reasons for recording it were more like astrology. For example, predicting when to go to war, to use astrology information to make decisions about religious and political and civic things.
would you say some of those particular things you talk about, like some examples, maybe like for in terms of the solar cycles, or like for predicting droughts, or predicting like for the crops? Would you say that it might not necessarily be science, but like they had scientific methods that they use in somewhat
like application?
yeah.
Well, the methods are essentially scientific. They're collecting information through observation and writing it down, right? So right away, that's a kind of methodology, to use the term. It's a big term, but yeah, they're collecting data, right? Their method is to, but they're not doing it to increase knowledge that's then going to be used to talk about the expansion of the universe in modern physics sets, or particle physics, or whatever, right? Or light refract. They're not doing that. They're doing it so they can use that information for other cultural institutions. It wasn't for science's sake. It never was. That doesn't make it bad. In fact, it makes it kind of good in a way, because they're using it for practical, everyday, and supernatural reasons. So again, you're talking about worldviews that are sort of different. It's more like astrology than astronomy, right?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it definitely involved, observing the stars, like tracking the planets, but it was not necessarily for what we...
Hey, Alex, you're the king of some ancient Maya city. You need to know when we should plant. You need to know when we should reap. You need to know if and when we should attack our neighbors, and so on. So you're taking hallucinogenic, mind-altering things to get out-of-state stuff, out of body stuff, altered states, and you get information, and that's all in the context of where the stars are, all this kind of thing. It's kind of like Ann Landers stuff. It's more like astrology. But it doesn't nullify the fact that they're still collecting information. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's so fascinating to think about, but they do kind of use that term astronomers, and it's kind of...
They do, and they use it incorrectly, because you think of guys that are looking through microscopes and, telescopes, and so on, and they're writing in notebooks to figure out the distance between planets and what the origin of the Earth is, and whether... Don't forget, the Maya didn't even understand that the Egyptians, that the Earth was round. The Earth was a multi-layered, flat-like thing with four corners. Right? They're not doing this for science. They're doing it to explain the world around them. So it fuses into all aspects of life. And most ancient cultures did exactly this to varying degrees. Stonehenge, it's an observatory. It was also a burial ground, and people were doing similar things.
Right. All right, so look, just to kind of bring it back, you've been doing this for 4 decades as an archaeologist, and your work with the History Channel and your work in Mesoamerica, but I know you've traveled probably around the world. You've probably been to Easter Island and all these different, megaliths, but is there anyone that stands out to you as just being magical, or kind of just your favorite, or kind of one that just sticks out?
Favorite place on the planet?
Or like megalith, or, structure, kind of.
I was going to say my hometown, but... beyond my personal favorite, not really. I don't. Not that comes to mind readily. I mean, I could go off on 10 or 12 really cool places, but the point is that for me, and this is going to probably be like bursting a balloon that you may have thought I'd answer it a different way, but for me, these places are, although super interesting, and it takes you back in time, and you can kind of get sucked into sort of the seeing a narrative of what once was and is now gone, and all that kind of thing is really, really cool. But for me, ultimately, it's about answering questions that people can't answer yet. It's about collecting information to sort of address what were the family sizes in ancient Maya society, or what did they eat, or did they have extended families, or were they living in nuclear families, or how often and how far did they go to get their corn and their pottery, basic kind of things. So to me, I see the things, I reconstruct them, and it's really cool to be able to do that at a detailed level when you're in one of these places. But ultimately, they're tools through which you can answer questions. That's really what it's all about.
Okay, yeah, no, I get it. Have you ever visited any of these, famous archaeological sites or monuments not professionally, maybe like as a tourist, or been kind of awed by something in that sense?
Of course. Yeah. Most of them. Yeah. I just cruise around and I look at stuff and read about it or see it. Or, yeah. Oh, yeah. I can't just show up. I'm not like, it's a bit like a doctor, say, who's a heart specialist. Yeah. He's interested in compound fractures, but he doesn't do compound fractures, but he understands them a little bit. And archaeology is a bit like that. I mean, if I was in Easter Island, I don't know a lot about in fact, I kind of do, but that's whatever. Let's say I didn't know a lot about Easter Island. I could still go and learn a lot and so on, but I can't just waltz in and start doing excavations in Easter Island any more than the doctor who fixes broken legs can do open heart surgery. It's the same kind of thing. Expertise.
Right.
Yeah.
I basically just wanted to ask you, the kind of last thing is about the whole ancient. So you said you're a consultant, and they're not really open to having you like have a debate or kind of bring up these other perspectives we talk about. It's more just using little.
Well, I don't know. The fat lady hasn't sung yet, right? It's not finished. So who knows? Maybe they'll wrap it up that way. I don't know. The better way to think, the short answer is no, because they have a winning formula. Clearly, they've been doing this for over 10 years. So they don't want to disrupt the apple cart. That's, they're selling commercials and they're doing all right, right? So it's entertainment and entertainment. People like it. It's all good. They got a winning formula. Why would they wreck it by, introducing a bunch of straight science by a boring guy like me? I don't know.
Now, we mentioned, of course, a lot of the stars that show are not scientists, but there are some where they say that, a PhD or expert or whatever, such as yourself.
Well, yeah, but notice that they're never saying anything. They're setup people. They're setting up, they're talking about the legitimate stuff, our legitimate science, the legitimate understanding of these things based on empirical data. And then somebody comes on and says, what if ... And then you're off in, the planet Xeon talking about people getting impregnated or whatever the hell they're talking about. So the experts with PhD like me, they're paid people that go on the show and deliver some expert content. And I hope, Alex, that most people that watch it can tell the difference between somebody like me talking and somebody with a bouffant hairdo who looks like they just put their finger in an electrical socket and needs Thorazine, right? Thorazine is an antipsychotic drug. So, and people, I think the people who make the show fully understand this. It's entertainment.
Right.
But I do agree with you, Alex. I think it'd be awesome if they bring the two battering rams together and get a little of that going on. But who knows?
Well, maybe, for instance,
call them up.
If not, an ancient aliens where you're kind of debating them, maybe create another show where it is actually just about like the legit archaeology. Because it sounds like you've,
I've tried.
They're not for it. They're against.
Well, it's not who's they. I mean, these are businesses. So you approach them with an idea, and they're in the end, it costs a lot of money to make a TV show with archaeology where you're sending crews to wherever, some part of the world. You're talking probably $500,000 or more to make each episode, maybe closer to $1 million now, I don't know, to make each episode from start to finish, right? And if you're doing that, or you got some guy, for a small crew of 5 people in Arkansas looking at, small town pig farmers with bad accents, I don't know, whatever they're doing on, some of these shows like Swamp People or whatever these shows are, it's a lot cheaper to make that. Yeah. So if you can sell the same ads by spending less on the production, well, what would you do?
Yeah, economically, it's,
Yeah, it's a business.
Right.
And, it's a cool show though that they have. I think it's an all right show. But I don't really watch it because I get kind of irritated.
Yeah. Speaking of these type shows, do you know or do you watch or know about Josh Gates and Expedition Unknown? I guess he says he's an archaeologist. But
no. I've heard somebody say something to me about that's adventure stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not. I mean, he doesn't necessarily go into like ancient aliens at all. He does more kind of like
it's a travel show,
Indiana Jones type stuff. But he's an archaeologist.
There's no such thing. It's a travel show showing you some ancient sites. You got a guy who pretends he's tough, I guess. Or I've never seen it. I don't know.
Okay. I was just curious because it's a pretty.
And I think it's a travel. It's been described to me as a archaeology kind of travel show.
Yeah, no, that I would describe it that way. It's definitely a travel archaeology show.
Good for him.
Yeah. No, it just seems like maybe that would be something you like could have done or would do, or that would be perfect.
Oh, I do it in a heartbeat. Again, Alex, if you want to be my agent and pump me up there, I'm down. A guy called Alan Morton, he's from Cambridge originally, Canadian guy like me, and I put together several versions of a show like the one you're talking about, and we marketed it quite a bit, and there was interest, but it kind of came down to things are kind of going in a different, it's Hollywood, right? Trends, they follow them or whatever. But yeah, I'm always down to do stuff like this. So feel free to pump me up. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's been a couple hours. I think we talked about a lot. Is there anything else maybe you want to, like any other?
No, I wish you luck on your podcast.
Thank you. No,
I think it's a great idea. And if you ever see Phil again, tell him I'm one of his biggest fans.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no.
Phil's made me pull off the highway probably 15 times.
Yeah.
I seen him on the radio, and I was laughing so hard that I was going to get in an accident. I had to pull over.
I've had some.
He's a very unique talent.
Absolutely. Did you watch the documentary, Hendry?
No, I didn't get a chance.
I appreciate your time. Thank you for very enlightening and very cool conversation. So
you need me in the future, I'm more than willing to come back and talk about new discoveries or whatever you want.
Very cool. Awesome. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Dr. David Cheetham, thank you for joining me at bluebeach.tv. Thank you.
Glad to be here.
All right. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Bye.